Okay, so tonight's topic. The topic is church and state beyond party politics. My day job, my professional job, is professor of global Islamic politics, so political science at Deakin University. So you would expect that I would think politics is important, which I do. I think politics is important, not because of the interesting quiz we just did with Sandy. There's lots of trivial pursuit type questions that are kind of fun, but frankly aren't that important. The shortest serving Australian Prime Minister 1 week, I mean, who knew that? Not very important, really. The questions about democracy are more important. And of course, we're living in a time now where there's some really important aspects of politics. So we're not going to discuss COVID-19 and maybe in questions we discuss political responses if that comes up. But the point is, here's a standard linear scale of deaths. Tragic news, and I don't want to make light of it. And there's all sorts of reasons why countries differ. But at the moment, the US and the UK, two of our oldest and largest democracies that should be showing us the way with good government and good politics, have suffered terrible human tragedy in part because of poor leadership. So politics matters, it makes a difference. I mean, there are more people dying in those two democracies than have died in the Battle of Britain and the London Blitz, for example, or the Vietnam War, or the 9/11 attack, because of failure to take strong leadership decisions early on that could have prevented loss of life. So that's a very immediate example. And of course, we're grateful in Australia for leadership at state and federal level, which has helped to keep the death toll in Australia to 100 or so people at this stage. It'll rise, unfortunately, but there's a big difference. America is 15 times our size, but you can see that 100,000 deaths is out of proportion. So politics matters. It makes a really big difference. Maybe you don't care about who was the first Prime Minister of Australia, but you sure care about what the current Prime Minister of Australia is doing now. I wanted to talk about the principles I want to approach in discussing politics because, perhaps when you were growing up, I mean, I grew up quite a long time ago, as you figured out now, the standard adage at the time was, when you meet people, don't discuss sensitive topics like politics or religion. Well, I work on the politics of religion, so I'm over my head. But I'm very conscious of the fact that whether it's on those sensitive topics or indeed anything else, that we need to be gracious and patient. My wife will be the first to tell you that's often not the case in our house, but that's my human failing. But it is important to remind ourselves that we need to not win arguments, but give a reason for the hope that we have. This, of course, refers to the gospel, but it also refers to other matters, important matters. The thing about politics is it's important and we need to pay attention, but there isn't a singular Christian position on which party we should support or which leader, for reasons I'll unpack shortly. And that means that we're going to find people who differ with us on the choices we make. And often when it comes to policy, parties do things for, as it were, party political reasons, not because of good policy reasons, but even where they're trying their very best to come up with a good reason, often we just don't know which is the right policy response. It can take many years before we figure out which one seems to have been working better, and even then it's not clear. So politics is very uncertain. So in this issue particularly, we need to be patient with those who share a different point of view and open to their perspective. For those who are involved in politics, they'll be much more effective if they do that, notwithstanding that politics often seems like a contact sport and seems very competitive. The best politicians, the best leaders are those who listen and form broad friendships. And for Christians, needless to say, it's more important than ever that we're gracious and patient. I've put this next slide here. You recognize C.S. Lewis, and you would probably recognize Timothy Keller, who's founder of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York. Just to tell you where I'm coming from, or you might say where you come from, CrossCulture Church, so you figured that out. Well, not everyone joining tonight or later on is from CrossCulture, and not everyone at CrossCulture necessarily shares the same views about lots of things, even the way they might approach Christianity. So this is just a frame where I'm coming from, generally speaking, and specifically with regard to this question of Christianity and politics. I find Timothy Keller a very helpful preacher and teacher, and he doesn't have much to say about politics at all. That there is this op-ed in the New York Times from a couple of years ago, which speaks about the important point that he makes. He says he doesn't tell people how he votes. It's important that he doesn't get framed in a party political position. But he also wants to say that Christians shouldn't be saying that there's one party that is Christian, one party that's not, because that might seem reasonable at some points in time, but it actually leads to all sorts of mistakes. And the position I'm taking on Christianity here, apart from coming from this broad progressive evangelical position that people like C.S. Lewis and Tim Keller represent, is a broad position, what C.S. Lewis in his wartime radio talks referred to as mere Christianity. He explained that he had certain convictions himself, denominational convictions, but when speaking of Christianity generally to a general audience, you don't need to speak of those denominational differences. It doesn't really matter what your beliefs are about how somebody or when they should be baptized, for example, or how church government works, or about eschatology or other things. We can talk in general about Christianity, and when it comes to questions of politics, that's what we're doing here tonight. So whether you're Anglican or Baptist, or you come from CrossCulture, or you're Roman Catholic or Greek Orthodox, that isn't really a point of distinction for what I'm going to say, because I think we would agree on the basic points of mere Christianity. I mentioned Tim Keller when I was looking around for ways of framing this talk, recognizing that this is contentious territory for Christians, particularly at this point in time. It was important to find some guideposts to frame what I was saying, but also to help put things in perspective. And looking at Tim Keller's writing, he doesn't write much about politics, but he did write a foreword to a book 10 years ago called City of Man, a reference to St. Augustine that we'll come across in a minute. City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era, written by two authors who served in Republican presidential White Houses, Michael Gerson, Peter Wehner. Michael Gerson, who's now often writing for the op-eds for the Washington Post. I've read his work without realizing the connection until I found this connection via Tim Keller. But he served with President George W. Bush as his chief speechwriter. He's long been involved in conservative, that's to say, Republican politics in the American context initiatives, and it continues to be so, although he takes a stronger line of criticism about contemporary Republican Party. A recent book, for example, makes an argument about why that party, in his view, needs to shift its position. Peter Wehner served in 3 Republican administrations: Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush. And he also has carried on in public life as a public intellectual. And a recent book is The Death of Politics. And you can see from the title, How to Heal Our Frayed Republic After Trump, that he has some strong views as well. So I just put that out there, not because these two men share my views, or rather, I don't necessarily share their views on politics on many practical details necessarily, but I have found this book, The City of Man, to be a really helpful book, and I broadly share what they're saying from a Christian perspective about the broad principles of Christianity and politics in this book. And in fact, I found it so helpful that I've pinched most of my talk from it. So whether that's good or bad is for you to decide, but I would recommend you go out and read this book. It's a really helpful guide, and it forces us to think about some things which perhaps we had found inconvenient to think about. Now, I mentioned that Timothy Keller wrote a preface to this, or a foreword, I should say, to this book. In the foreword to this book, he said that evangelicals often think that, we shouldn't really be thinking about politics. We should think about the gospel. After all, evangelicals are called evangelicals because of evangelism, because of the gospel. Of course, evangelicals have a long history of being involved in politics, as we'll see in a minute. Still, there's a temptation sometimes to say that, look, our job is religious matters. It's not really talking about politics. But the issue is that we don't really have a choice. Even if we don't talk about politics, we're involved in politics simply by making a choice not to be involved, if that makes sense. The choices we choose to make, the choices we pull back from making, commit ourselves. So, for example, the German Lutheran Church in the 1930s took a two-kingdom approach to Christianity and politics, it says there's the kingdom of God, Jesus Christ, of the church, and there's the kingdom of this world. And we have to be active in both kingdoms, but both kingdoms do their own things. So Christians don't interfere in politics. And unfortunately, that meant that the German Lutheran Church ended up effectively, bit by bit, like the adage of the frog slowly boiling to death in a saucepan, ended up coming around to publicly support National Socialism, the Nazis. Not where they meant to go at the outset, that's where they ended up. Very, very tragic consequences. And of course, it damaged the witness of the gospel in Germany, in the church. In South Africa, there was a different tradition. Tim Keller, of course, is from a Presbyterian, therefore a Reformed tradition, something that I have a lot of sympathy for. But in South Africa, the Dutch Reformed Church there, which followed Abraham Kuyper's position that Christianity should be influencing culture and also politics, ended up supporting apartheid. Not only did it end up making the mistake of supporting apartheid, but it used Christian justification, justification which ultimately is racist. A terrible mistake made from a different tradition of approaching Christianity and politics. So we're seeing erring at both extremes. We can go wrong in both directions. So as I said, Lutherans followed a two-kingdom approach. They got that wrong. Reformed Christianity likes to think of itself as being very intellectual and believing that it has the task and the capacity to help transform culture. Well, there's wisdom in both approaches, but if you make a mistake in either direction, then the consequences can be very great indeed. So a simplistic approach to Christian politics, either one that says that we shouldn't be involved in politics, leave that kingdom to itself, or that we need to, as it were, take back our country for Jesus, which seems like a reasonable thing to say, that simplistic approach is inadequate. It's inadequate because the moment you start pushing down the path of how it plays out, it leads us to endorsing things or going into company that really isn't congruent with where we stand and with our values. So we need to make a choice. But the choice that we make is going to depend upon the context that we find ourselves in. If you're a Christian in China today, your opportunities for involvement in politics and what you should be doing as a Christian in politics, well, it's a matter of your conscience, of course, but it's going to be different than if you're in America or in Australia or New Zealand or some other democracy. And of course, the issues of the day. If you're voting in America this year, you'll have different things on your mind than if you're voting in Australia in a couple of years' time at our next election. But there is a big difference between whether you're in an open society or not. So we have to work out what our position is and what the important issues are at a personal level. And that's one thing I agree on Tim Keller with very much. That's why he doesn't write about politics very much. It's not for the church, not for our local church, for our church at CrossCulture on Swanston Street in Melbourne, or for our denomination, or for any church to say this is the Christian position. That's a mistake. It's also a mistake for the individual Christian to say, well, politics has nothing to do with me. So why was the Lutheran approach in 1930s Germany wrong? Well, it ended up doing great damage to the Christian witness and the reputation of the Lutheran Church in Germany. It ended up endorsing, although that wasn't the intention at the outset, what became a genocidal fascist regime. And it reminds us that there are dangers in societies, both that recognize religion. The Lutheran Church is a state church in Germany, and in societies, of course, that banish religion. I mean, in China, we legitimately say the persecution of Christians is sad and tragic and mistaken. It doesn't help China, and it's certainly unfair to those who are suffering that persecution. But you can make mistakes in both directions. A strong democracy with the state church can still make great mistakes, and the state church can be part of that mistake. Well, we might say that our concern really is, as Jesus put it, his kingdom is not of this world. But in a sense, although Jesus clearly was not coming to earth to take on the Roman Empire and to save the nation of Israel, that certainly wasn't his intention. He was coming to build a kingdom which goes beyond this world. What he had to say about the way we live in this world was political. he didn't set out to be political, although he was very conscious of what he was doing. There was a sense in which he was executed as an enemy of the state because of the way he, in the providence of God, the way his presence at that time played into local politics. And that's not to try and be tricky or to be clever, but it's to recognize that as we take up our cross and follow our Lord, at times that will have political consequences. It's just inevitable. We are living in the city of man, to use that Augustinian expression that we'll come to shortly, but we look forward to the city of God. But for the time being, we have to be concerned about the world that we live in and have to try and make our best contribution as we can to this world. Christianity doesn't have a blueprint for politics. It certainly would argue, for reasons that I'll point out, that good leadership is better than bad leadership, just leadership is better than unjust leadership, and accountable politics is better than unaccountable politics, despotic politics. And that's why at this point in time, the process of accountability through democracy is something that Christians can support. But throughout history, individual nation states and democratic systems are quite recent, but throughout history, Christians have wrestled with this. And one of the strongest images came from St. Augustine's writing all that time ago, when he said that we have to live in this world in a kind, as it were, in the city of man, even as we looked forward to the city of God, that's the world to come. And we have to play our role in this city of man. We have dual citizenship. We are focused on the world to come, and we want to speak of the reasons for our hope about the world to come. But we're also living here, and we have to live responsibly. We can't just opt out and say that it's not our responsibility. If that question of opting out of a mission can be as deadly as making choices, sins of commission that are mistaken. So we're sort of walking a tightrope. As Gerson and Weiner put it, we like that image of Jacob wrestling all night with the angel of the Lord. We're kind of wrestling with a different issue, and it's a constant dynamic issue. It's never fixed. From month to month and from year to year, and certainly from decade to decade, it shifts and changes as their own personal experience testifies to, which is what makes their book so interesting to read. Whether we choose to make judgment or suspend judgment, we're making a choice. And I'll try and unpack what I mean by that. So we can't avoid this question of Christianity and politics. It's something we're going to have to deal with. But what we can do is follow certain key guidelines about how we do it. As I said at the outset, we need to be gracious. We need to be humble. We need to be open to different points of view. And we can address important political issues without being partisan. Sometimes we say being political and we think immediately of being partisan. Well, when you go to the polling booth and you vote, you have to choose a party or a candidate. You are making a value judgment as an individual about which you think is the best to get behind at that point in time. But we don't generally, as Christians, come out and say that this particular party, this particular person is the person who represents Christianity. Now, I know that Christians often make what I would argue is that mistake. I'm not making the case tonight for us to be party political in public as Christians or as churches. I'm saying we need to pay attention to the issue of politics, and we need to ultimately make a choice when it comes to voting, obviously. But apart from that, we need to try and be as non-partisan as we can and see all the issues most broadly. When it comes to a question of what might be the right path for us as individuals, or even what might be most obviously the best path for Christians to get behind, that's going to shift from time to time and to circumstances to circumstances. I'll talk a minute about the civil rights movement in America. I have a very clear view about which was the right side of history, which was the position that Christians should have been behind. I think the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was doing the right thing in the providence of God. So sometimes there's a very clear position, but that's not partisan. So if we're talking about opposing racism, as Dr. King was, if we're talking about justice, as he was, if we're talking about compassion and concern, etc., often people of different parties have a lot of good to contribute and a lot of genuine conviction. And we need to enter into those discussions with that open and gracious approach. Let's go back to first principles for a minute and try and unpack this sense of why we need to pay attention to politics. Politics is messy. I've said that we're not being partisan, but even when we're trying not to be partisan, we often say, well, you know, there's things that are unpleasant. Sandy talked about Indonesia. We talked about the democracy index. Indonesia is doing pretty well, but it's got a long way to go, as all countries have. But Indonesia started on its path to democracy only in 1998. So there's a lot of groundwork to do, and problems of corruption, etc., are still there. And when we look at corruption, every country deals with this. Top of the league, Norway still has problems. Australia certainly has problems with corruption and politicians behaving badly. We might want to sort of just hold our nose and say, I don't want to be involved in this business that's so unpleasant. Why should I care? Well, we need to go back to first principles and say, God cares about politics. No, I don't mean God cares about whether your candidate wins. I mean, God cares about what sort of society we live in, the way it's governed. God is not a remote and detached creator. He's not indifferent. He, of course, is sovereign. He's omniscient. He's omnipotent. But he's working out his purposes. Now, we are living in a fallen world, but God is still active in this fallen world. So when we say that God is light and God is love, those are tremendously large concepts beyond really our human understanding. What it's saying is God, the being who created and controls this creation, this universe, is, in every sense that we understand the word, good and loving and light and just. Every good thing that we can imagine, every good thing that we experience, every positive thing that we know to be something we need to aspire to or to support is found in perfection in God. And that's why we have this sense of right and wrong. And that's why we have the sense of natural law that I'll talk about in a minute. And that really guides how we think about politics. God cares what happens. Yes, bad things happen because we're fallen creatures, and God allows bad things to happen in the sinful world. It doesn't mean that he's indifferent, and it doesn't mean that he doesn't care and that he isn't still active in what's going on. God became human, and this is a really important thing for us to take in. There's a lot of mystery, deep mystery. I think C.S. Lewis, the reason why he's one of my favorite Christian writers is because he so powerfully conveys a sense of this mystery, not through apologetics, as he does in Mere Christianity, but through his fictional writing very powerfully. And he helps us get a glimpse into understanding something of this mystery of incarnation, of God becoming human. But because God became human, because God entered into history, it also set the path for the way in which the world works for us who are brought into a relationship with God. God has come into this world through Jesus to redeem us and to draw us back to himself. He's come to rescue us. But he's not saying just get in the lifeboat and get out of here. He's saying, I'm going to use you in the world that I've placed you in. Just as I came into my creation, so I'm using you as my agents. So he's omnipotent, he's sovereign. He's given us free wills, which is why we have this problem of sin. And he's given us, even in our sinful state, an understanding of right and wrong. He's hardwired us to understand that. He's given us a deep longing for good. But beyond that, he actually intends to use us in this world to do good, whether it's at a micro level in our place of work, in our families, in our immediate relations, or at a macro level, at the level of the nation state or the globe. A lot of those things we don't think of as being as political, but just as the way that Jesus lived was political, it impacted on politics of the day. Even more so in many ways, he intends us to pay attention to try to make the world better. Jesus was in the world primarily to redeem us, to die on the cross, and to teach us the way back to his Father. But we who are given decades of life to live in this world, apart from speaking of the hope that has been given to us in this redemption, are also supposed to be using our time in this earth to make a difference. And God is working through us. He chooses to work through us. It's a deep mystery we don't fully understand. But we are his handiwork, we're told, and that we're created in Christ Jesus for good works. And those good works are good works that God prepared in advance for us to do. And what I want to argue here is to say that those good works are not just Sunday things. They're not just church things. They're not just gospel things. The good works that God prepared in advance for us to do, sometimes they're easy to understand. If you're called to be a nurse or a doctor, then the good works there are pretty clear and easy to understand. But in every area, for every profession that we're in, no matter how public or how private, no matter how prestigious in the eyes of the world or how low-key in the eyes of the world, God has called us for a particular plan and purpose, and often that involves an engagement which involves politics. And for those of us who are called into an opportunity to engage in public life, even just making choices, we need to understand that this is not our life. God's working out the good works that he called us for and planned for us in our lives, and he's working in the world through us. So that puts politics in a different light. Now, what does God think about politics? Well, clearly justice and mercy, compassion, some of the biggest themes of the Bible. Throughout the 66 books of the Bible, certainly through the Gospels, certainly through the epistles of the New Testament, but also through the books of history that talk about the experience of God's people in particular, and through the books of the prophets and through the teaching of the prophets, a constant theme is calling God's people back to justice, calling them to do right, calling them to oppose evil, and calling us to be compassionate, to help those who are afflicted, to feed the hungry, to free the captives. That's what God, that's where the heart of God is. And we're called to do this in this world where we live now. So St. Augustine put this very strong concept of the city of God and the city of man. Yes, the Bible uses the language of Zion, of the New Jerusalem as the city of God, of our eternal home. And St. Augustine said, well, there's a city of man that we live in right now. And we have, in as much as we have some say in shaping how that city works, in the way we live our life, then we need to push where we can towards justice and to compassion and fairness and mercy. There is no perfect political system. Norway scores at the top of the Economist's list of most democratic states, which in most respects probably means it's one of the most, the best governed states. But Norway, the Norwegian state, is not perfect. No state is perfect. Every state has strengths and weaknesses. If we think about COVID-19, for example, some of the best responses in terms of strong leadership comes from states that are strong democracies, Taiwan. But, in Asia, one of the best responses has come from Vietnam, which is not a democracy, single-party communist state. And yet, with respect to COVID-19 and the health of the 96, almost 100 million citizens of Vietnam, they've done an excellent job. This is the complexity of politics. Our part is to do our very best towards making politics as best we can. So if we're at a church in Vietnam, we have different options than we have if we're at a church in Taiwan. But in either case, we can try and make a difference. And Christians are called to serve in government. They're called to serve in ministries. They're called to exercise roles. And that's where we need to think about what we can do to try as far as we can push things in the direction of justice and in the direction of compassion and concern and care. There is no blueprint for politics in Scripture. That should be obvious by now. In fact, the New Testament actually doesn't give us a whole lot of blueprints for anything in terms of the way we live lives. The blueprint that is clear is in terms of values and relationships. There's no question about that. But even when it comes to how churches work, there's a little bit of information, but not that much. That's why we argue about how churches should work. And so we have different denominational traditions. When it comes to family life, there are some clear instructions, but even there, it's principles, values, rather than absolute details. When it comes to public life and to the nation state, well, there is no blueprint at all about politics, but there is very clear teaching about values. And we recognize that there should be a question of moral concern. We recognize a hierarchy of moral concern when it comes to things like war, slavery, poverty, etc. There's no question about that. And Gerson and Weiner, who, as I said, served in these Republican administrations, men of great experience, and I think their book is really helpful because of that experience and not because of their Christian faith. They are the first to point out that some Christians have got this very right when they've gone into political life, whether it's working in the office of a president, whether it's running for president, whether it's an elected office, or whether it's simply serving in the machine of government. But it's this road of being directly involved in politics is a tough road. Christians are called to walk down this path. In the Bible, we have many examples of Christians nobly serving. Sometimes as prophets, like the prophet Nathan, they had to correct an otherwise godly king, King David, when he'd fallen into murder and adultery. A remarkable context there. Or Daniel, when he was taken away with the captives, and yet served really as we would say today, as a civil servant, as somebody involved in public service. Throughout history, Christians have been involved at all levels. Sometimes they've done things very well, sometimes they've made great mistakes. The problem is when Christians do badly, they can do great harm, not just for themselves and for the causes they think they understand, but also for the reputation of the gospel of Christianity. So there's a lot riding on this. And as Gerson and Weiner say, after decades of involvement in American democratic politics, we see, as it were, to quote 1 Corinthians 13, through a glass darkly. We have, using that image of the first century where there were no modern mirrors, where when you're looking at a mirror, a polished metal surface most likely, you were not getting a clear vision. And so our understanding of things of the next world is very incomplete. There's much mystery there. Our understanding of what we should be doing in this world is often very incomplete when it comes to working out what the best policy is and what we should be doing. So it's a hard road to go, and mistakes will be made. And sometimes those mistakes will have enormous consequences. Think of the Lutheran Church in Germany or the Reformed Church in South Africa. We have a lot of responsibility here. Our responsibility, though, is to find our way through, to do it as best we can. Obviously, as Christians, we do it prayerfully. We fall back on the principles that are very plainly taught to us in Scripture. We seek wisdom, we seek counsel. Gerson and Weiner, who are Republican officials serving in the White House, said that forming friendships across the political landscape is very valuable. Sometimes having somebody from a different political position can help you understand issues better. And I think democratic politics works best when people form those friendships broadly. And when Christians go into politics in whatever role, it's really important that they not only act with integrity and grace, but seek wisdom and recognize good wherever it might be. So we constantly have to examine our hearts and our motives. There's a lot of ego in politics, a lot of vanity. There's a lot of attraction being close to power. There's a lot of fun in being involved in things of public life. It's important we get engaged. That's what God's calling us to, but we have to be very careful. We're dealing with a situation which the Bible describes very well. The Bible tells us that human beings are fundamentally flawed, but also that we're made in the image of God, and we're left with a very strong imprint from our Creator about right and wrong and good and bad, and strong impulses to do the right thing even though we fall short. So human beings are neither angels nor devils in that sense. We're neither completely black nor completely white. We are dealing with imperfect creatures. Politics deals with imperfect creatures. The most heroic of Christians make mistakes, whether they're Christian ministers or missionaries, preachers, teachers, or politicians, or serving in public office, or supporting those serving in public office. Our heroes make mistakes. They have feet of clay, to use that biblical image. They're imperfect. And that's the world of practical politics, if that's the world that we're called to engage in directly, or even if we simply are weighing up who to vote for and who to support. We recognize the imperfection that's inherent in a human system. Nevertheless, there are degrees of good government and bad government. And the reason we aspire to support governments to become as good as they can be is because a wise government can not only deal with human beings with a realistic understanding of the flawed nature of humanity. That's why we need police forces, we need militaries, we need laws, we need jails. We can do better or worse with those things, and they're things we don't want to be using all the time, but we need to have them because of the flawed nature of humanity. But a good state, a wise government, can create stability in which people can flourish and become their best. We might say, well, I care about my family. My family is the most important thing. Well, the way your family lives depends very much on the state that you live in. With COVID-19, there are some countries in the world at the moment where you are safer than others because of political leadership. There are some countries where, as a Christian, you have more liberty than in others because of politics. There are some countries where your quality of life, with your access to health and education, etc., varies according to the quality of good governance or bad governance. Doesn't necessarily equate with democracy, by the way. It's a complicated relationship. I mentioned Vietnam a minute ago, doing a good job with COVID-19. But it means that politics really matters, and that the extent to which the government gets things right makes a big difference to the way we can live our lives, including our lives as religious people with religious freedom. I talked before about God being light and love. We understand something of the mind of God. There's great mystery when it comes to understanding God, but we understand very clearly what he stands for, where his passion, as it were, runs in human terms. God loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of his unfailing love, we're told in the Psalms. We're told that we should be following justice and justice alone. And we're told, and this was said to the people of Israel, of course, but it's a general principle for all of us that our lives will go best when we follow justice and support justice, and that when we support corruption and injustice, things go bad for us as individuals and as nations. And we need to understand that God cares about the poor. One of the things that the prophets were speaking about most often was widows, orphans, strangers, and often they were chastising the nation of God, the people of God, for failing to follow God's heart in this matter. We know that that if our hearts are following after the heart of God, if our minds follow after the mind of God, then we will be concerned about injustice. We will not be indifferent to it, because God is not indifferent. In fact, Jesus says something very radical in Matthew 25. It's surprisingly how radical this statement really is. If you go back to Matthew 25, he says, I was hungry, and this is in the context of a parable, but the parable is pretty direct and pretty clear. I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes, you clothed me. I was sick, you looked after me. I was in prison, you came to visit. Whatever you did for the least one of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Of course, the disciples say, well, people might say, well, when did we do these things for you? He said, well, I was in the world as the stranger. What you did for the stranger, you were doing for me. That's an aspect of incarnation that we often overlook. Not only did Jesus come into the world as a human being, he remains engaged in this world and is concerned for everyone. Human beings particularly, there's a great value in every single human being that we underestimate at our peril. We sin when we don't see the value of the image of God in each human being, each equally value in God's eyes. The stranger, the poor person, the beggar, the person sleeping rough on the streets, in God's eyes is as valuable as we are, and he wants to work in this world for their good through us. Radical stuff when you think about it. And I mentioned natural law before, and this is a very helpful way of sort of beginning to wrap up where we're getting to. This is not a complete guide to Christianity and politics. That would not be possible in one short talk, and I'm certainly not expert enough to do that, but I'm just wanting to provoke you to think about Christianity and politics. So what we're told is that God's people were active in this world, working in certain ways that we can learn lessons from. Now, we know that Paul was a great apostle. We know that he was a great evangelist and a great teacher. But even in his evangelism and his preaching, we can see, for example, when he goes to Athens and speaks to somebody who was educated in Greek contemporary education and could speak of earlier, what we would now say classical Greek education, he could speak to the people of Athens in their, not just their own language of Greek, but in terms of their own philosophical concepts. He could translate the gospel. He said, you know, you ask who I worship. Well, you have here a statue to an unknown God. Let me tell you about the unknown God who is the true God. He used their language of philosophical reasoning. I have become all things to all men, Paul wrote, so that by all possible means I might save some. Now, he's speaking of the gospel here, of course, too, but it also, this process of translation plays out in every area in which we want to bear a message, the message of the gospel, but also bear a message of cultural change and hope in this world that we live in. That includes politics. So when we try and think about how we can communicate our Christian position on the values that we see in the heart and the mind of God, we can reach out and find a point of connection with people. Just as the people of Athens put a statue to the unknown God, they didn't understand, and Paul said, I'll speak to you of this unknown God. So too, when we talk of right and wrong, all of us show that we recognize that there is right and wrong. And now not everyone understands or accepts that that's because there is a creator who made us and who is a moral being. But the imprint of our creator in us as his creation is very clear. And it's a bridge. It's a point of contact that we can use to reach out to people. That might seem a little bit esoteric, but there's a couple of examples here that Gerson and Wena give that I think are very helpful. So Martin Luther King, I mentioned earlier, they mention a number of examples, but two in particular, Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln, two of the famous reformist figures in American politics. They were committed to reversing, they said, the two great sins, or two of the great sins, not the only sins in American history, but certainly slavery and segregation, both in the 19th century and the 20th century, were things that King and Lincoln worked on. King was jailed on one occasion in 1963 in the city of Birmingham. And in Birmingham City Jail, he wrote a 7,000-word letter responding to his critics, including his fellow Christians, who said, look, why don't you just work these things out in a peaceful fashion through the courts, through democratic means, not through protest. What's the civil rights protest? You know, Christians don't need to be doing this. So King wrote in response that his concern with the civil rights campaign was a just law. And he said that this just law, which Thomas Aquinas speaks of, is a moral law. It's a law that tells us that God made us as moral beings, and that we all have equal value in the eyes of God, because we're all made in the image of God. And that what this means is that segregation, racism, very powerful in this post-slavery America, still a powerful problem today in 2020 America, still a problem in Australia too, if we're honest. The segregation, racism is not only politically, economically, sociologically unsound against the interests of America, it's also morally wrong and it's sinful. So he used that sort of religious language, but he used it in ways that were powerfully able to connect to ordinary people. He wasn't just using Christian language. A century earlier, Abraham Lincoln, when he was in Illinois in Lewiston, gave a famous speech in which he quoted the Declaration of Independence, something he often did. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he went on to say, this is what our founders understood, that this majestic interpretation of the economy of the universe, in other words, the mind of God, this guided them in writing that Declaration of Independence. So here, Lincoln is saying we recognize these things, this natural law, as also Dr. King put it, and the fact that we know that there is right and wrong, that there's good and bad, the fact that we can see an evil and know that it's evil, tells us that there's a creator who made us to understand this. And when we understand that he made us all equal. And that's why treating each other in unequal fashion, as was the case with slavery or ongoing racism, is contrary to the mind of God, contrary to everything that's right. And that's something we can all agree upon, whatever our approach to God is. And even if we don't believe in God, if we acknowledge right and wrong, we can agree on this much. We find this as a meeting point. And so Gerson and Wayner, who had this, very remarkable experienced careers at the highest levels of American political life, inside the White House, inside multiple administrations, said that here's an important lesson for Christians, that we can be tempted to speak in a language, and in this book, by the way, they're very critical of the Christian right, or at least they're critical of what became of the Christian right in America with the Republican Party. And the reason they're critical is to say we can succumb to the temptation to use our religious faith and the scriptures as a partisan or a political trump card, no pun intended. But when you look at the lives of Lincoln and King, you can see that their eloquence was not, their success was not based on their eloquence, although their eloquence certainly helped. Their success was being able to persuade men and women by the logic and the rigor of their arguments, and by the fact that it connected with what we understand intuitively as human beings, what's right and wrong. They could make this link with the fact that we know that there are things that are right and there are things that are wrong, that there's justice and injustice. And that's to speak a common language, which goes beyond just the sort of church language that Christians often use amongst themselves. They also gave this very practical point. They said that in public life, working in politics, it's important to connect, and I mentioned this earlier, with people whose political views we don't necessarily agree. I don't necessarily agree with Gerson and Wayner a lot of their political positions, but I certainly respect what they're saying, and I've learned a lot from their book. C.S. Lewis has this nice image in The Four Loves. He says that there's different kinds of friendships that, famously, if you think of the way that art portrays it, or perhaps for those of us who were married when you were first married, the way it was, as opposed to how it is perhaps decades later, where being side by side is more common than being face to face. But lovers might embrace, they might kiss. Friends generally sit down side by side and talk in that fashion. It's a different kind of friendship. And as it were, in political life, you might be sitting down side by side with somebody where you're not sharing every conviction and every understanding of political matters, but you can still sit by side, shoulder to shoulder. And that's what they're urging us to do, to maintain the spirit of grace and reconciliation. Sometimes that means, of course, in the rough and tumble of politics, that you lose, that the team that you're supporting at that moment in your individual capacity, you don't get the result you're looking for, but you must always be gracious and recognize when the other side is doing something which should be recognized as being right, credit where credit is due, and in any case, to form friendships across the political spectrum. So finally, of the city of God, we know very clearly that we are called to a city, the New Jerusalem, Mount Zion, where there will be no more death, no more tears, no more suffering, no more injustice. We won't need to be involved in politics in heaven, in the city of God, because God is completely in charge. Here on earth, we pray to our Father in heaven that his will be done on earth as it is done in heaven. And part of that prayer is a prayer that he expects us to answer as best as he providentially gives us occasion to do so in the way we live our lives in this city of man. The city that we're coming to is a city in which he is so perfectly in charge, we don't need to worry about politics. But right here, we in this world do need to be concerned for the city that we live in. Yes, it's true that we live just a few decades, a few years, and this earthly tent is destroyed. It's replaced by a permanent dwelling, a permanent city. But right now we're living in this city of man, and we need to take a responsibility. We need to care for order and justice. It's our home at the moment. So Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, we make it our goal to please him, whether we're at home in the body or away from it, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Each of us must receive what is due for the things we've done in the body, whether good or bad. Now, Paul, of course, is speaking in this passage about the ministry of reconciliation, about being ambassadors for God, about the ministry of the gospel. But it goes beyond just that. And the mistake we often make as Christians, particularly as evangelicals, is to think too narrowly in terms of just what we narrowly define as the affairs of the gospel. Everything we do in this world will be called to account at that seat of judgment. We believe in purpose and order, and we believe in a day of judgment. We are saved by God's grace through Jesus' redemption of us. But nevertheless, even as saved creatures, we still have to give an account for the way that we have spent our life. Like the parable of the talents, we might come to our day of judgment and before the judgment seat say that we've buried the opportunities and the riches that God has given us because we were scared. We will use the excuse that he's a harsh judge. That's the wrong answer, of course. Or he might say, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in small things. Now you'll be faithful in big things. We don't know what that means in the life to come, but in the city of God, there is no politics, but there is work. And one of the mysteries of that city of God is that the work that we do in the life to come will depend upon how we live our life now. And that involves many things. It involves family and friends, the gospel. It also involves politics. Finally, and this is our last slide before we go to questions, a quote from another Republican. You shouldn't mistakenly try and interpret my political views from the people I quote, but credit where credit is due. And Ronald Reagan actually was one of these presidents that had many great quotes. He, of course, before he was president, was an actor. So whether he wrote the lines or whether just deliver them doesn't really matter. We can look at the lines and see. People who work with him said, though, that this quote was something that he lived by. He would often say, the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is a friend and an ally, not a 20% traitor, or my 80% friend is not my 20% enemy. In other words, you can have political disagreements, whether within your same party or across the political aisle to other parties, but just because you disagree on some things doesn't mean that you can't be friends or even allies on a noble cause. And we face many political challenges in this world in the years ahead of us, many big, difficult things, and we will need to do them together across political parties to be effective. And I believe that God calls us to care. He calls us to be gracious. He calls us to be used as his instruments in many good things, including these political things. And he calls us to work side by side with people who will have different convictions on how that plays out in politics. So that, in a nutshell, is a very quick primer on the case for thinking about politics and being engaged in politics. But it's really just to provoke you to think. It's not the complete story by any means.